Honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour for me to follow my good friend from British Columbia, who in his last number of months in Parliament have been a strong advocate for Atlantic Canada, and his role as fisheries critic for the Conservative Party brought attention to a range of issues which shows that if you're a parliamentarian here with knowledge and passion, you can represent all Canadians and indeed a region on the other side of the country, Mr. Speaker, that has not received such representation despite 32 members of Parliament. Every single member of Parliament from Atlantic Canada is a Liberal member. And I'm going to highlight some of the hypocrisy that some of the members are demonstrating with their lack of commitment to equality for Atlantic Canada on one of our key institutions, Mr. Speaker. In particularly, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice, who feigned outrage regularly if you touched the Supreme Court of Canada Act in the last Parliament, Mr. Speaker, but now he describes the long-standing Constitutional Convention to have an Atlantic Canadian jurist on the top court as just a custom, Mr. Speaker, when before he expressed it as a requirement of our diversity as a country, Mr. Speaker. It's actually disappointing, profoundly, because I like a lot of these members from Atlantic Canada. As someone that spent a lot of time there myself, I know they're well-intended, but it's about time that they start to speak up to their Prime Minister and their Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker, correct this major omission, and start showing that there's more than just silence of the lambs in Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. I'm passionate about this, as you can tell, Mr. Speaker, because I'm a product of the outstanding legal system and legal education system in Atlantic Canada. Dalhousie University, Mr. Speaker. Dalhousie Law School, now known as the Schulich School of Law, is the oldest law school in the British Commonwealth, Mr. Speaker, founded in 1883. And in fact, the early classes from Dalhousie Law School in Halifax, those graduates became the deans for most of the early law schools across the country, including in Alberta. And Alberta still has a tradition of sending a number of great young minds to Halifax for their law school experience, starting with many people like Joe Lougheed, and son of the former Premier, my friend Luke Day. That mix at Dalhousie, one of the finest schools, produces great legal minds. And it is the law school for Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. There's a special admission provision. And between Dalhousie and University of New Brunswick, some of the best legal education in the country, Mr. Speaker. And from the early days of our country, those lawyers, those judicial minds have forged Canadian law, both here in Parliament, in legislatures, and at the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker. And for the Prime Minister to just wave that aside is rather insulting, Mr. Speaker. For someone that claims diversity is a fundamental tenet of his government, geographic diversity and the tradition of an Atlantic Canada seat to secure that geographic diversity seems like an afterthought. Atlantic Canada's first Justice, William Johnstone Ritchie, Mr. Speaker, a Nova Scotia-trained barrister who became the Chief Justice of New Brunswick and was an appointment from New Brunswick, was appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada by Alexander Mackenzie, the first Liberal Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Study history, 32 from Atlantic Canada. The history is there. It was Sir John A. Macdonald, when he returned to office, a Conservative, that made Ritchie the first Atlantic Canadian Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker, and some of that early jurisprudence is still referenced today. These are important traditions within our country, Mr. Speaker, and to think that they can be so callously swept aside, even when the entire Atlantic Canadian geography is represented by the government party, is astonishing, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask them to go and think about that. You can visit the grave of Justice Ritchie at Beechwood here in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker, which is emblematic of the significance of the Supreme Court to this country. Sir Robert Borden, a Nova Scotia-trained lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and my favorite Prime Minister of this country, holding a country together through the challenges of the Great War, started the Canadian Bar Association, Mr. Speaker. So, in fact, Atlantic Canada blazed the trail for common law jurisprudence and, in fact, our legal education and judicial structures in Canada. No question about it. Punched well above its weight since the earliest days of Confederation. In fact, Joseph Howe, Mr. Speaker, the father of representative government, granting to Nova Scotia the first standalone representative government of a British colony at that time. In Howe's tradition, I would ask the 32 to start speaking up, because they're not living up to the ideals of the men and women who have come before them, Mr. Speaker. And most recently, someone I had the honor of meeting, Constance Glube, who just passed away this February, another Dalhousie law grad, Mr. Speaker, and the first female Chief Justice of a provincial court of a superior court in Canada, Mr. Speaker. I could go on, but it's disappointing that I have to give this primer to the Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker, because she, and particularly her parliamentary secretary, should not disregard this important tradition and this convention as easily as they're doing. I'm going to show that hypocrisy from the last Parliament, Mr. Speaker. The MP for Charlottetown, who I like, who's a lawyer, and we practiced for a time at the same firm, although I was a student and he was a partner in Charlottetown, said of this in February 2014, I say that because the Supreme Court of Canada Act is also a piece of legislation that be considered of the utmost importance, given how the Supreme Court influences all our institutions, it's a matter of national importance. And that's when he was complaining about changes through a private member's bill. We have no bill before this House, Mr. Speaker. We have the Prime Minister deciding on a whim to erase a century of history. Yet the MP for Charlottetown seems quite fine with that now. At least with a private member's bill, we had debate in this chamber. We had to bring this debate here through an opposition day motion. He then went on to say in that same debate, in normal times when matters regarding the appointment of a Supreme Court justice arise, we would be assured that the process would unfold in a manner that was inclusive and meaningful for Canadians, as they expect matters of the Supreme Court to be, and for appointments to be made to ensure proper linguistic, gender, and regional balance as part of the process. That's the MP from Charlottetown who's taken part in this debate today, who now just calls that a custom. There was a custom of having a judge once in a while from Atlantic Canada. I'd ask him to stand up, Mr. Speaker. It's time for a couple of them. The Minister of Fisheries, another graduate of the Atlantic Canadian legal education system. In June 2015, the member from Charlottetown also complained that the Supreme Court Act had an amendment made in the Budget Implementation Bill, Mr. Speaker, and he feigned quite a bit of outrage at the time on that. We don't even have legislation before this chamber, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister feels that he can do what he wants, and so far the 32 from Atlantic Canada are allowing him to govern that way. Nothing highlights it better, Mr. Speaker, than a legal action brought by the trial lawyers of Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, saying that the Prime Minister's conduct constitutes an amendment to the Constitution of Canada, Mr. Speaker. What they're doing is actually, in the view of leading Atlantic Canadian trial lawyers, is unconstitutional. Where's the member from Charlottetown on this, Mr. Speaker? This was filed September 19th. Specifically, they cite Section 41D, the composition of the Supreme Court of Canada, Mr. Speaker, an essential feature of our Constitution directly and through convention, Mr. Speaker. The composition for over a century has had Atlantic Canadian representation, and Justice Cromwell, a distinguished jurist, was just the most recent example of that in the long line that goes back to Chief Justice Ritchie, Mr. Speaker. So it concerns me that in and amongst the photo ops and press conferences that the Prime Minister feels he can not only disregard a century of constitutional convention, can disregard the profound and, in fact, leading impact made by Atlantic Canada to our modern judicial system, Mr. Speaker, and claim that he's doing this with diversity in mind. Diversity is as much in our regional differences and our viewpoints that comes from the lived experience in these regions, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's a convention. It's just one seat. To take that away from the part of Canada that actually gave us our modern common law is atrocious. And now is the time for the 32, led by the MP for Charlottetown, to show some backbone and say no to this Prime Minister.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for La Salle-et-Mar. La Salle-et-Mar Verdun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his comments. Just curious in his interchanging use of the words custom and convention, if perhaps he could elucidate us on the actual difference between those two words.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And had I had more time to do a little more research, I would have checked to see if the School of Law at McGill, where I know my friend taught for many years, had its early dean as a Dalhousie graduate. I would go out on a limb to say likely, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I think McGill was one of the later law schools to adopt the case law approach trailblazed at Dalhousie, Mr. Speaker. And Dalhousie followed the Harvard tradition. So it really goes back that far. As the member well knows, our Constitution is both written and by convention. And that convention is reinforced and reinforced the longer the practice is maintained. And in this case, I would suggest, and I hope he would agree with me, that in terms of constitutional convention, that also fits with the spirit of Section 41D of the Constitution Act 1982. This is probably one of our oldest and most profound constitutional conventions, Mr. Speaker. I highlighted the word custom because in the last Parliament, the MP from Charlottetown found that the diversity, having the Atlantic Canadian Justice on the Supreme Court of Canada, was fundamental. Now he seems to be backing away from that, Mr. Speaker. I would say for somebody that is a well-spoken and thoughtful MP trained in the legal system by Atlantic Canada, he should now stand up for it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank our honourable colleague for his eloquent speech. And I don't profess to be an expert in the legal system, but I have listened intently to the interventions throughout the morning, and language such as open and transparent, high quality, have been used from members of the government and the folks across the way, and indeed our colleagues from the NDP, which has tended to, I guess, cast shadow or doubt on the quality of the applicants that we've had previously, or the Supreme Court justices that we've had previously, or the processes that we've had, or as my honourable colleague has just said, perhaps that the quality of the talent or the jurists that we might find in Atlantic Canada might be in question. And is he indeed actually hearing the same when we're listening to the interventions from our honourable colleagues from across the way?
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend from Caribou Prince George, and particularly having visited that part of the country this year, passionate people represented by a passionate advocate, Mr. Speaker. And that's why he's concerned about this as a BC MP, as are some of my BC colleagues with me here today, apparently more than the 32 Atlantic MPs, Mr. Speaker, because I don't see them speaking much other than the MP for Charlottetown, who's under strict orders from the Minister of Justice not to stray from script. But he's raised a good point. I think the lawsuit or the legal action asking for an order from the court declaring the Prime Minister's conduct unconstitutional, it's from the Atlantic Provinces Trial Lawyers Association. So he asked me, is there an impression that this callous act by the Prime Minister is having a negative impression in Nova Scotia? Well, a legal action suggesting it's unconstitutional by the people, the men and women who make their livelihood advocating and defending people in our courts, that's a pretty good indication that they feel it's an affront, Mr. Speaker. And I would suggest the Parliamentary Secretary, the MP for Charlottetown, is likely still called to his bar there. He should talk to some of his colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.